What if serving your country wasn't enough to protect you from being treated like a criminal in your own homeland? What if a soldier in uniform was still seen as a threat just because of the color of his skin? This isn't fiction. This happened, and what unfolded inside one of America's busiest airports left a nation stunned, outraged, and finally ready to listen. In today's video, we uncover the powerful true story of Staff Sergeant Darius Freeman, a black soldier who came home expecting peace and found prejudice instead. But what started as humiliation quickly turned into a reckoning that would shake the system from the inside out. If you've ever questioned the price of dignity or wondered what justice really looks like, keep watching, because this story will stay with you long after the final frame. In the chaos of crowded airports and hurried goodbyes, one man walked with calm dignity, his uniform crisp, his purpose clear. Staff Sergeant Darius Freeman had just returned. From an overseas deployment, the weight of sacrifice stitched into every thread of his military dress blues. But as he stepped through the terminal in Atlanta, what should have been a moment of reunion became a confrontation, one that revealed how deeply prejudice still runs, even in the most public of places. Racial profiling isn't new, but when it happens to a decorated soldier in full uniform, the implications hit differently. Darius, a disciplined U.S. Army Staff Sergeant, became the target of suspicion and violence, not for anything he did, but for how he looked. White officers accused him of impersonating military personnel without checking his identification, twisting his arms and degrading his honor in front of a growing crowd. It was more than disrespect. It was a public execution of dignity, one rooted in systemic disbelief that a black man could serve his country with pride. As phones recorded and voices rose in outrage, a question echoed through the terminal. When those entrusted to protect become perpetrators of discrimination, who holds them accountable? In this real-life story, justice didn't arrive in the form of revenge. It came from courage, exposure, and the unwavering demand for truth. This is not just the story of Darius Freeman. It is a story about America, about how easily honor can be dismissed and how powerful accountability becomes when the crowd refuses to look away. What happened next turned the tide, not just for Darius, but for every person who's ever walked through a public space and been seen as a threat simply for existing. This is where the confrontation begins. It began like any other homecoming. Staff Sergeant Darius Freeman stepped off the plane into the bustling terminal of Atlanta International Airport, his Army service uniform crisp and dignified, his name stitched proudly over his heart. He was 36, a combat veteran returning from months overseas, and his only plan that afternoon was to surprise his mother before heading back to base in North Carolina. But as he walked through the terminal, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, something shifted in the air. The smiles weren't welcoming. The eyes weren't grateful. They were suspicious. He could feel it. The woman near the coffee stand who clutched, her purse tighter, the airport security agents whispering into radios, the TSA officers who didn't blink as they locked eyes on him. He had worn this uniform in places far more dangerous than a domestic terminal, but somehow this return, felt more threatening. Still, Darius kept walking, scanning his phone for a message from his ride. Then came the voice, sharp, commanding. "Hey, you, stop right there." Darius froze mid-step, every instinct trained through years of discipline kicking in. Slowly, carefully, he turned to face two police officers pushing through the crowd. Officer Bradley Kane, stocky, buzz-cut, with one hand resting too casually on his holster, led the charge. His partner, Officer Cole Maddox, thinner but just as hostile, scanned Darius like a threat already confirmed. Kane barked, "Where'd you get that uniform?" Darius stayed composed. "It's mine. I earned it." The response only seemed to fuel Kane's skepticism. "We got a report of a stolen military uniform. You match the description." A small crowd had started to gather now. Phones came out. Whispers spread. Darius took a breath and asked calmly, "Are you asking for identification?" Kane sneered. "No need. I can tell by looking." Maddox stepped closer, his expression curling with disdain. "Open the bag. Let's see what else you're hiding," Darius replied firmly. "Not unless you have probable cause. You have no legal right to search my belongings without it." That was when Maddox leaned in and dropped the word like poison. "Listen here, boy. You do what we say or we'll make you." The insult didn't just echo. It cracked through the air. Darius didn't flinch. "I'm not a boy. I'm a staff sergeant in the United States Army." Kane didn't care. "You expect us to believe that?" He yanked the bag off Darius's shoulder and spilled it onto the floor. Documents, medals, military dress blues, all laid bare. "Fake," Kane muttered. "Just like the uniform." "I want you to call my commanding officer," Darius said, holding firm even as his voice trembled. "He'll confirm everything." Maddox shoved him hard against a wall. "You ain't getting favors today." The situation was escalating. Cameras captured it all. A black veteran being publicly humiliated, his service questioned, his dignity stripped, on American soil in front of strangers. And in that moment, every step Darius had taken to serve this country came crashing into a wall of ignorance and power. And still, this was only the beginning. Everything was unraveling fast. Kane reached for his cuffs. Maddox tightened his grip on Darius's arm, twisting it back with a force meant to hurt, not restrain. Darius clenched his jaw, his body tight with control. He wasn't going to let them break him. Not here, not like this. Around them, the terminal had gone from curious to concerned. Phones were up, murmurs were rising. Someone shouted, "That's racial profiling!" Another voice followed, "He's not resisting!" And then, out of the crowd, an older black man stepped forward, his voice strong despite the years behind it. He wore a veteran's cap and a look that said he had seen too much of this world to stay silent. "I've been watching this whole thing," he called out. "This man hasn't resisted once. He's not a threat. He's a soldier." Kane scoffed, but the impact was done. The crowd shifted. People stopped walking. They started filming. The officers tried to push forward, but the tide was turning against them. Darius, his voice calm but iron hard, said, "Do you have any idea who I am?" Maddox rolled his eyes. "Yeah, a fraud." But then, before anything else could be said, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. Deep, commanding, undeniable. "Unhand that soldier." Silence. Even the background noise of the airport seemed to pause. Through the crowd came a tall figure in full uniform, badge gleaming, his eyes sharp and furious. Captain Elijah Monroe. Every officer in that terminal knew who he was, and the moment they saw his face, Kane and Maddox went stiff. "Captain," Kane muttered, his voice cracking. Monroe didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I said unhand that soldier. Now." There was a beat, a long, dangerous moment, where everyone waited to see what would happen next. Then, slowly, reluctantly, Maddox released Darius's arm. Kane stepped back. Darius straightened his uniform, his breath steady, his pride intact but bruised. Monroe stepped closer. "Are you all right, Sergeant?" Darius nodded. "Yes, sir. But these men just accused me of stealing my own uniform. They assaulted me in public and they refused to check my ID." Monroe's jaw tensed. He turned to the two officers. "My office, now." "But Captain," Maddox started. "I said now," Monroe snapped. The command left no room for argument. The officers obeyed. The crowd began to cheer. Some clapped. Others simply watched in stunned silence. A woman wiped a tear from her eye. The elderly veteran nodded with solemn pride. Darius exhaled. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in that entire confrontation, He wasn't standing alone. Inside the airport's security office, the atmosphere was heavy with silence and suppressed tension. Officers Kane and Maddox sat rigid in metal chairs, their faces pale and uncertain. Captain Monroe stood with his arms crossed, his stance a wall of calm fury. Not far behind him, Darius stood against the wall, his uniform still crisp, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than any shout. He wasn't there for an apology. He was there for justice. The door opened, and in walked Chief Russell Harding, a stocky man with a navy suit, silver hair, and eyes that scanned the room with a cold calculation. He looked at Darius, then at Monroe, then finally at the two officers. "Tell me what happened," Harding said, voice low but steely. Before Kane could open his mouth, Monroe stepped forward. "Chief, these two officers publicly accused a decorated U.S. Army Staff Sergeant of impersonating a soldier. They refused to check his ID, assaulted him, dumped his personal belongings on the floor in front of a crowd, and then lied about him, resisting arrest." Harding turned his gaze to Kane. "Is that true?" Kane swallowed. "Sir, we were just doing our jobs. We got a report about a stolen uniform, and this guy fit the description." Harding's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Interesting, because I reviewed the airport surveillance on my way here, and from what I saw, the only thing Sergeant Freeman was guilty of was walking while black." The color drained from Maddox's face. Kane looked like he might melt into his seat. Harding wasn't done. "Not only did you humiliate a soldier, but you also falsified a report saying he resisted. That's a criminal offense." Maddox blurted out. "We didn't mean—" "Sit down," Harding snapped. The room froze. Maddox obeyed. Monroe folded, his arms tighter, backing up Darius with silent solidarity. Harding turned back to Darius. "Sergeant Freeman, on behalf of this department, I sincerely apologize." Darius's voice was calm, but every word hit with weight. "Apologies don't fix what happened out there. Those men tried to humiliate me, assault me, and deny my service, all in public view. And if it weren't for the crowd, I'd probably be in a holding cell right now. Something has to change." Harding nodded slowly. "It will." He turned to Kane and Maddox. "Effective immediately, you are both suspended without pay pending an internal investigation. If found guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, or discrimination, you will be terminated and stripped of your badges." Kane stood up, defiant. "Sir, you can't be serious." Harding didn't flinch. "I've never been more serious." He tossed a thick file on the desk. "These aren't your first complaints. Racial profiling, excessive force, misconduct. And now you've gone after a war hero. You're lucky I'm not pressing criminal charges." Maddox's hands balled into fists. "This is unfair," Monroe finally spoke. "You think unfair is being accused of stealing your own uniform? You think unfair is being shoved against a wall in front of strangers, treated like a criminal for serving your country?" He stepped forward, voice low but thunderous. "You don't know unfair, but you're about to." The room was silent. Kane slumped forward, defeated. Maddox glared but said nothing. Harding pointed at the door. "Get out." As they left, dragging their feet, Darius watched them go. "Next time you see a black man in uniform," he said, steady and clear, "show some damn respect. We fight for this country too." Monroe let out a breath. Harding ran a hand over his face. "Sergeant Freeman," the chief said, "if there's anything you ever need, you come directly to me." Darius nodded, then paused. "What I need is for this to stop happening to people who look like me." Monroe placed a hand on his shoulder. "Today, we made a start." The fallout from the confrontation didn't end in the airport's back office. In the days that followed, word of what happened to Staff Sergeant Darius Freeman spread like wildfire. Footage from bystanders went viral across social media platforms with hashtags like "Justice for Darius" and "Not Just Another Stop" trending nationwide. National news outlets picked up the story. Veterans groups issued statements of support. Civil rights leaders called for full transparency and institutional change. But for Darius, this was never about going viral. He didn't want attention. He wanted transformation, and he was ready to make sure it happened. With Captain Monroe at his side, Darius met with Chief Harding again, this time in the official city administration building. He laid out, point by point, not just what happened to him, but how it fit into a larger pattern of racial profiling and unchecked power. "I'm not just here as a soldier," he told the chief and the city review board. "I'm here as a black man who knows this isn't the first time. The only difference is that this time you had cameras, witnesses, and someone in uniform who knew his rights. But what about the people who didn't?" Harding nodded, more solemn now. He had begun reviewing dozens of prior complaints tied to Kane and Maddox, most dismissed quietly, labeled unsubstantiated. But a pattern had emerged: vague justifications for stops, disproportionate targeting of black and brown travelers, and officer reports that didn't match eyewitness accounts. Chief Harding authorized an immediate internal audit, not just of Kane and Maddox, but of the entire airport precinct's history of stops and use of force cases. He partnered with Monroe and brought in independent oversight to ensure transparency. "No more looking the other way," Harding said in a press conference. "If we want to rebuild trust, we start with accountability." Darius also became involved in training and reform. He joined a roundtable of veterans, civil rights attorneys, and police ethics instructors to build out a revised protocol for identifying military personnel, handling accusations of impersonation, and de-escalating confrontations. The goal wasn't just justice after the fact. It was prevention before the damage could be done. At the next city council meeting, Darius stood before the chamber and told his story, not with bitterness, but with resolve. "I don't want another black soldier coming home from duty and being treated like a threat in the country they swore to protect," he said. "The badge should represent service, not suspicion." Monroe introduced new measures requiring bias training and quarterly conduct reviews for all airport law enforcement. A new civilian complaint tracker was launched, with outcomes made public. And quietly, but notably, officers who had long histories of misconduct began to disappear from the roster. What started as one humiliating moment on a public escalator became a reckoning. Not just for two bad cops, but for an entire system that too often protected them. And Darius, who once stood alone at the mercy of prejudice, now stood at the center of reform, proving that real change starts when someone refuses to back down. Justice, for many, feels like a concept that lives in courtrooms or headlines, but for Staff Sergeant Darius Freeman, it came in the form of a moment when truth could no longer be ignored. What happened in that airport wasn't rare. It wasn't new. And that's exactly why it struck such a deep chord across the country. Darius didn't ask for a spotlight. He simply wanted to get home to his family. But fate had other plans. And in standing tall through humiliation and hostility, he sparked a wave of reckoning far bigger than any one badge or title. He never raised his voice. He didn't swing back. He didn't fold. Instead, he did something more powerful. He endured. He demanded dignity. And then, when the system expected him to stay silent, he spoke. And what he said, what he stood for, rippled through a nation, desperate for accountability. His confrontation with injustice revealed just how fragile some systems of power are when met with calm defiance and an undeniable truth. But more than that, his actions revealed what's possible when people rally together, not in outrage alone, but in resolve to make things better. Because justice, when reimagined, isn't just about punishing the wrong. It's about empowering the right. Thanks to Darius, reforms are in motion. Conversations once ignored are now policy. The shadows where bias once hid are being exposed to daylight. And young men and women of color, whether in uniform or out, now know they're not alone. They saw someone who looked like them stand up and win. But this story doesn't end with suspension letters or press conferences. It continues in every officer rethinking their first impression, in every citizen recording injustice, in every department rewriting policy, and most importantly, it continues in every person who refuses to let silence be the answer. So if this story moved you, if you felt the tension, the injustice, the power of truth spoken calmly, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Let it challenge you. Because justice isn't static. It's not an institution. It's a living thing. It breathes through our choices, our voices, and our unwillingness to look away. Darius Freeman reminded us of that. And now it's up to us to carry that truth forward. They tried to shame him. They tried to silence him. But in the end, Sergeant Darius Freeman stood his ground and showed the world what real courage looks like. If this story stirred something in you, anger, pride, heartbreak, hope, don't scroll away. Your voice matters. Comment below what part hit you hardest. Share this video with someone who still believes change is impossible. And most importantly, subscribe for more true stories that reveal what justice, dignity, and humanity really mean. Because silence never changed the world. But stories like this, they just might.